Good morning, lovelies. Today we are looking at the horror movie genre and examining it through a feminist lens to find out if this genre really is sexist or feminist, as well as the final girl trope. Because as much as we love watching spooky stories this time of year, I think it's important to critically examine the subliminal messages that they are conveying to us. Those messages that get internalized by the audience. It's the whole reason I came up with this channel. And the horror genre has a long, sometimes complicated relationship with women, so let's take a closer look. Alright, let's start with the "it's sexist" argument. People who claim that the horror movie genre is sexist often point to the sexual objectification of women that is rampant in this genre, as well as all of the violence against women. Let's talk about the violence first. Unless you are the final girl, being in a horror movie is bad news. I mean, so is being anyone in a horror movie, but when you're a woman specifically, in addition to possibly being murdered, you also have things like rape, sexual assault, and stalking, and other issues that affect us in the real world every day. And while the women on screen are being raped and or murdered, they are often, half naked or fully naked, especially in the classic slasher films. Now this is partially to punish them for the totally natural act of sex, which does not have any morals in and of itself in it, and they just finished with it, so of course they're not going to have a whole lot of clothes on them. This is also done partially to enhance the feeling of vulnerability, to enhance that horror, because when you don't have any clothes on, you feel really vulnerable. But it's also mostly because the person behind the camera is a man, let's be real. Now, is it okay to put things like nudity, stalking, and rape in a movie that's going to be consumed by people for entertainment? I covered this topic way more in depth in my rape and sexual assault in science fiction and fantasy video, which I highly recommend you check out if you haven't already. But the general conclusion that I came to was, it depends. Normalizing, or worse, fetishizing such horrible, traumatizing events just to shock or turn on your audience? No. Bad. But skillfully implementing those real-life horrors into a greater narrative arc, treating them like the traumatizing, horrifying events that they actually are, and then letting the victim process that, possibly by dismembering certain body parts from her attacker. Yeah, you know what? Go for it. So that's the violence bit. I mean, yes, violence against women is rampant in horror movies, so is violence against literally every other character that appears in a horror movie, so they don't really have a leg to stand on with that. So now, what about the sex thing and the sexual objectification? It is a classic rule in horror movies that if you want to live, don't have sex, or you will die. While boys and girls are subject to this rule, there is a discrepancy in time spent punishing them. The man's death is often faster and less painful, while the woman's death will be dragged out, and again, she will be half naked or fully naked this entire time. But the sexual objectification of women is true in every genre. Now, as for punishing people for having sex, I'm not a huge fan of that. I don't see sex as a moral thing because it's really not, unless you're cheating on someone, in which case, fuck you. But A, that's been going away in recent years because more people are kind of thinking that way. And also B, the punishing of both men and women for that same action is unique to the horror genre. Usually it's the woman who is punished and the man is rewarded, or at least gets away clean. Honestly, I find the horror movie genre no more or less sexist than any other speculative fiction genre. And there are some damn good arguments as to why it is in fact a feminist genre. So let's talk about the "it's feminist" argument. Alright, first of all, 70% of all horror movies pass the Bechdel test. This makes it the second most likely genre to actually get two named women talking about something other than a guy. The first genre to pass was music. Now, while that is not the best way to determine whether or not a story is feminist or has any decent women, narrative arc or characters, it is a really good sign. And it's also no surprise. Many horror films center around a woman character who will often have friends. I mean, she's the final girl, the main character. She's the one who is spending most of her screen time fighting back against this horror. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But either way, it's her story. We have passed the Mako Mori test, which is, in my less than humble opinion, a much better way to gauge whether or not a story is feminist or has good women representation. On a similar note, horror is one of those rare genres where women are allowed to not just be scared, but overall emotional. Other speculative fiction genres kind of belittle or demean women who scream when they're terrified or, cry when their friend dies because, you gotta be a tough girl, you gotta be a strong female character, whatever the fuck that means. But while, some people might dislike specific characters for how they're portraying their fear, we still want to see their fear. We want to see their emotional response to whatever horrifying thing they're going against. Half the time when we're watching a horror movie, we're not scared because of the monster or the villain or whatever they're doing on screen. We're scared because the actors are showing how scared their characters are. We're relating to that. Now, what about the fear of women in horror? There's this micro subgenre of horror that's like exploring women puberty and sexuality via this genre, like Ginger Snaps. You got powerful female villains. Blair Witch is the classic one. Jennifer's Body is kind of the newer one, but there's also Carrie. Matter of fact, King has a pretty interesting quote on Carrie and what it represents. Carrie is largely about how women find their own channels of power and what men fear about women and women's sexuality. Which is only to say that writing the book in 1973 and only out of college 3 years, I was fully aware of what women's liberation implied for me and others of my sex. The book is an uneasy masculine shrinking from a future of female equality. Now, the sexism argument is that these stories paint women and women empowerment in a bad light. They're cautionary tales for the patriarchy about a symbolic representation of what could happen if women have equality. Now, while that may be true for some horror stories written by sexist little man-children, it's unfair to put that for the entire genre or any movie that has a female villain. Sometimes the point of having a female villain is to drive home the fact of how the patriarchy created such a monster, like The Witch or Midsommar. Other times, women are just assholes. Plus, the presence of the final girl trope shows that the horror genre is very comfortable giving protagonist women power. Sean S. Cunningham, who directed Friday the 13th, says, "The final girl in these little morality tales is the person who has embodied the moral code that society thinks allows you to go forward in life." Literally, I guess. Basically, she's a way for the film creators to reward good moral behavior, whatever that is and the time period or society that they're living in. Traditionally, that is abstaining from sex, drugs, and alcohol, and not being a bitch. The final girl is usually not like other girls. Instead of boys cheerleaders, she's all book smarts and introverted. At least, she used to be. This is seeing something of a subversion in recent years. So while the start of the final girl started off kind of sexist, you gotta be a virgin, the whole not like other girls thing, etc., I'd say that she's evolving into something a lot more universal and flawed, which is a good thing. More than that, having a female main character forces the entire audience, men included, to get in the mind of a woman. A traumatized woman at that. I mentioned in my Token Girl video that men are often discouraged from relating to female characters or female heroes in other genres, but the horror movie genre is the shining exception to that. But doesn't the final girl trope portray women as victims of violence, especially male violence? Classical final girls, yeah, they tend to be a pretty passive bunch. Modern ones, though, have grown a lot more proactive. Also, it's relatable. Many real-life women are victims of male violence. Domestic violence, rape, murder, those almost always happen to us by men. Horror movies that center around a final girl facing against a male threat often have a very loyal female audience because A, it's relatable, that fear, and B, it's cathartic, especially when that girl is able to fight back and deal some actual pain and damage to her attacker. Not a lot of women get to do that in the real world. But why a girl? Why not the final boy trope? Is it because girls are held to a much higher moral standard in the real world, and thus need to embody those standards in fiction? Is it because of the perceived power difference between a helpless woman and the usually male threat? Is it because our society so values the safety of women, especially white women, as seen in the real-world phenomenon of missing white girl syndrome, that the idea of anything threatening or hurting such a woman is just terrifying to us? It's probably a combination. And that last one is probably why about 99% of all final girls are white. So far I've been talking about this purely through like a men v women type of thing, as you would expect in a video about sexism and feminism. But true feminism is not just about securing equity for pretty cishet white ladies. We also have to talk about the LGBTQIA+ community, people of color, and people with disabilities, and their representation in horror is abysmal. We all know that when we go to sit down to watch a horror movie, anyone who is not cishet, neurotypical, able-bodied white person is not going to make it to Act 3. In fact, if you're neurodivergent and or in the queer community, there's a solid chance that you are actually the villain, because being genderqueer is just unnatural, and having to take any type of medication for a mental illness automatically makes you a serial killer. And unless you're in a Jordan Peele movie, you don't want to be a person of color. That is the true feminist issue in horror movies, and what we need to focus on when it comes to improving the craft. Yes, pretty white girls are getting tortured and brutalized on screen. So is everyone else in the horror movie. That's the genre. But they have a much higher survival rate and a much better portrayal than a lot of other people. And not only is this a social justice issue, it also makes the movie boring, because we know exactly who's going to make it to the end of this movie and who isn't. It kills the horror of the horror movie. Playing around with demographics is good for society and good for making a good quality suspenseful horror movie. So get on that, filmmakers. That is the complicated relationship between feminism and sexism within the horror movie genre. My battery's about to die, so I'll just say please leave your thoughts in the comments and I will see you next time. Bye, lovelies.